Now, about these, am I looking for these expansion sets? It's hard to call them expansion sets. It's more like individual sets that added to the overall saga. It's not so much that one was an expansion upon the rules of the other. Either one could be played without the other necessarily if you wanted to. In fact, there were starter decks for both. The first of these was released in 2004. It was known as Incursion. You would recognize Incursion if you had seen it in a store, with its booster and starter boxes looking a little bit something like this. In fact, exactly like this if you're looking for a booster box. You could have bought this game as either a set of 15 card booster packs, or, to get you started off, there were 4 pre-made starter decks for the original Incursion series. There was one just for the alien Quay, you know, the ones from Tangqua, the ones the Shi oppressed, the ones that rose up against them and forced them to move Sayal through the Mumon Rift into our solar system in the first place. Yeah, those hardy buggers, the Quay. The Quay got their own Incursion starter deck, entitled Swarm. So this was entirely based around the Quay, if you wanted to play that particular faction. But let's say that's not what you were looking for. Let's say you wanted something from the Earther side that was a little more spiritual, and you really like the idea of sort of samurai or an Asian culture combined. Not just samurai, but Asian culture in a broader sense, but a whole lot of samurai. I say that as I'm sitting here wearing something from Japan. I guess that means that I'm a traitor, seeing as how I'm the one writing a Earther novella. Sean E. Williams, this means nothing. I'm not turning to your side. If you had wanted to play a Gonjin deck, and really, why not just choose Earthers, you could have gotten Solidarity, a Gonjin-based starter deck. Now, the other ones, though, were mixed. If you wanted to play as, say, the Shi, the starter deck for the Shi was actually mixed with the Mavericks, and you got a Maverick and Shi starter deck called Suppression. On the other hand, say you wanted to still play as the Mavericks, but you really didn't like the Shi. You don't like that whole let's go and wipe out younger races kind of thing. You wanted something more hardy, perhaps more Earth-based. Perhaps you were feeling a touch of needing home. In that case, for the Earthers and Mavericks, they had the Alliance starter deck. So you basically had 4 different ways that you could launch into it with a 60-card deck that had various foils, exclusive cards in it, plus the different rule books. Eventually, they did decide to expand the series, and in 2005, early 2005, they launched a second set, or an expansion set, as it's sometimes called in gaming parlance, known as Nowhere to Hide. This was accompanied by a short story called Nowhere to Hide, but we'll talk about the short fiction in a later supplement here, a later video primer. In the case of Nowhere to Hide, the set was a little bit smaller. It was a little over 160 cards instead of being around 330. Again, you would recognize it. As I hold up this somewhat heavy box with a whole bunch of cards in it. You would have recognized it by this box on the store shelves, sort of a greenish tint box here. You would also have been able to find it in booster packs of 15 cards each, like cards with a D each, as you see right here, with a chance of getting a rare, of course, in each one. Or you got a rare, it's just a question of which rare you picked up with each one. And this time there were starter decks, but there weren't as many starter decks. As I said, you could have picked up wars with either of these sets, started with a starter deck, or just got a whole bunch of boosters and just started running into playing. No problem whatsoever. That's why I have a hard time referring to it as an expansion set. But there were only 2 starter decks this time around, but they made for some new interesting combinations. Whereas for the original Incursion set, you had Earther and Maverick, Maverick and Shi, but then Quay and Gonjin got their own. This time, the Quay teamed up with the Mavericks, in terms of deck building at least, in one called Cats and Claws. Notice this one's more of a greenish tint as opposed to red. It's an easy way to tell which set it's in. Also, you can check at the bottom. It'll tell you what set you're looking at right there. Then the Earthers and the Shi got their own deck together, which is called Overlords. Had to check. It strikes me, though, which one's missing? Gonjin did not get its own starter deck when it came to the Nowhere to Hide expansion set. One wonders if it was meant to happen with a little bit more frequency in later sets. And I say that because there were later sets that were meant to come out, but unfortunately they did not. The line was somewhat cut short. There was, at one time, at least according to reports, to be a set called Edge of a Sword, a set called Motion of Mind, and another set called Eye of Insight. Now, within these sets, you would find lots of different types of cards. Of course, I've shown you an example, for instance, with Jylland Wrath. We, of course, have Jack Wilgris, a character card here. He will be a major player in Jim Perry's Maverick novella. We have cards that deal with the lore of different characters that weren't based around characters like, say, Fortune Seeker, which talks about Pepper Tokarates. But what was interesting was that as you went through and picked up these cards, you would often find that your rares were one of two different types. Either a regular card, or, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this well on the webcam, a foil variant of that card. I'm kind of turning it in the light here so you can sort of see it shine a tiny bit here. They were the same card, essentially. You could play with either one. That way, you weren't having to run around trying to get all the foil cards just to have the really good cards perhaps to play with, but they were just kind of a neat thing to have. Some collectors didn't care which they had. Some collectors went only for foils. Some collectors went for a set that was nothing but non-foils. Either way, collectors apparently really enjoyed picking up this series. And I would hope that hopefully you might be interested in picking it up as well. Granted, you're not going to find it on store shelves probably at this point. I myself have picked up quite a few through eBay recently. They can be found relatively inexpensively, certainly a lot less expensive than it might have been at the time, though of course back then it was on par with all the other CCGs that were around, or TCGs that were around. It really has made for an interesting universe. As you go through the series, this lore, this card lore up here at the top, this was the building block of the entire universe, or the building blocks of the entire Wars universe. What we know about characters, situations came from these. And it wasn't just a little blurb on each one. Cards referenced each other, situations referenced each other, and as you played more and more, the pieces started to weave together this broader story. Of course, it would be up to an RPG company to later come in and flesh that story out, along with several authors of short fiction before Grail Quest books came into play and we began writing our novellas and comic book series. In the next primer, we'll take a look at the RPG, and after that, fiction, new and old.